sovereign God. God is sovereign over it all.
God is sovereign, 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 God is... Hey.
You keep using that word, but wouldn't you rather use a word that's more biblical and confessional, like Providence?
Are you even a Calvinist? In this video, we're going to review the Young and Restless and Reformed movement's rediscovery of the doctrine of God's sovereignty, and how it was an effective short-term assault on the 20th century's cultural message, God is dead. But because YRR's Calvinism didn't come to us as rooted in its confessional context, I'm going to consider why the term providence is a better word by looking at the Reformation's restoration of the doctrine of calling, about how providence is really just God masking himself with our callings, and the different New Testament passages on superiors and inferiors. Let's go! So the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement was a resurgence in the early 2000s of the doctrines of Calvinism, summed up as tulip, total depravity of man, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. This was popularized by figures like David Platt, Matt Chandler, John Piper, R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, Ligon Duncan, blah, blah, blah. I want to make a whole video about just the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement at some point in the future, God willing. So the phrase Young, Restless, and Reformed actually came from an article, everybody knows this, from Colin Hansen, and it was a good phrase. It just kind of captured the youthfulness of the movement and the restlessness of the movement, kind of hinting at the fact that a lot of these people were really, as I've mentioned in previous videos, just like wanting to, they really loved theology, and also part of that restlessness, in my opinion, kind of came from like a disenfranchisement with regard to society, kind of feeling like nerds, and we like craft beer, and we like theology, and we're restless.
As the last chapter, before you stand before the creator of the universe to give an account with what you did, here it is, Lord, my shell collection.
But we want something more to help us live our daily Christian lives, and it seems like the Calvinists are taking the Bible really, really seriously.
I don't know why you're clapping. I'm talking about you.
Because when you take the conversation over to the Arminians and you bring certain Bible passages to their attention, they will like quibble over words and not really use their brains. It looks like the Calvinists are using their brains. So if I'm talking about what kind of theology I want to commit my life to, I'm going to go over to the one that's like that, hey, they're the crew that uses their brains.
The first game is to go, well, I see that. I see foreknowledge and predestination, but I just don't think those words mean what you think they mean. Like, I know he said foreknowledge, but what I think he means is, and I know he said predestined, to determine beforehand, but what I think he means. And so I always just want to, if you read the Bible, does the Apostle Paul come off like a guy who uses slang? When he calls the teachers in the churches of Galatia those dogs, he's not saying those were his friends. Those whom he foreknew, he predestined. He means that those whom God foreknew, God predestined.
I think the influence of John Piper and his being influenced by Jonathan Edwards really captures this because of their emphasis on the God-centeredness of their theology. They were really, a lot of young people were really impressed by the God-centeredness of it all. And this didn't become any more clear than in the conversation about whether or not God was sovereign over all things. And so, most specifically salvation, so who is the final determiner of whether or not someone is saved? Is it God or you?
You were delivered. You were redeemed. You were transferred. You are the passive, not the active agent. There's one who gets glory, and check this, it's not you.
I mean, it's just this famous, like, hypothetical and very often real conversation. Who is the final arbiter? That's really attractive. The logicalness of it is really attractive, was really attractive, continues to be. But as many have already noted, this Calvinism came to us in the talking points of TULIP.
One of the reasons why this issue of the sovereignty of God in salvation, or tulip, which we'll talk about shortly, or Calvinism, however you want to describe it, one of the reasons for it is because these realities are, in Romans 8, the foundation of the most precious promise in the world. Namely, that everything works together for our good.
Conversations might even have gotten hung up on a doctrine like limited atonement. Well, is it limited or is it unlimited? Or is it, maybe definite's a better word. But where did that theology come from? And it actually came from a theological and confessional context that was not being highlighted as much at the conferences and on the podcasts and things like that. So I think it was Kevin DeYoung that actually said that what many in the Your movement started to do was go to the trash cans and see where their ancestors had thrown away their confessions, and they discovered that tulip actually came from these confessions. And so you had a lot of people, and this took place a lot in the Reform pub, which was a really wild place.
I want to talk about this Reform pub policy. Although we recognize that Doug Wilson is a figure that exists within the orbits of Reformed theology for a variety of reasons, we have observed that threads related to him are not productive in our group.
A lot of people were discovering their Baptist roots, and some were discovering their Presbyterian roots, and many went from Baptist to Presbyterian, and some back in the day did come from Presbyterian to Baptist, but that was not as popular. Now, in those confessions, you have an entire chapter dedicated to divine providence. And when you dig even deeper, you see that some Puritans wrote whole books on this. How many times do I have to say this on X and on YouTube? Go get John Flavel's book, The Mystery of Divine Providence, please. I'm not trying to breach your conscience. I just highly, 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 highly recommend it. When you start to dig into the doctrine of providence and its richness, its biblicalness, its theological consistency, you start to get this sense that's not obvious at first, but it's subtle and develops in you and kind of grows in you over time, that when you compare it to our modern way of communicating sovereignty, it starts to feel like sovereignty is an attempt to combat this pagan idea of determinism.
Costain wrote that fate was somehow related only to religion.
Samuel's writing, fate is immovable, like a mountain. It stands where man passes away.
But actually kind of feels like determinism at times. So it's like a short-term effective combation of liberalism and modernism, but it doesn't give something for your soul, to get underneath your soul and drive your daily Christian living. It's just like this talking point that you can win debates against Arminians with, and almost kind of like puff yourself up. Well, I believe that God is sovereign and others don't. I'm just believe that this lack of confessional depth is one of the reasons that it weakened a long-term way of combating culture, which is why I think the word providence is better. I'm going to dive into this much more deeply in a future video. Martin Luther's rediscovery of the doctrine of vocation not only reformed the church, but massively influenced Western culture and society and work ethic, where work went from burden to seeing God working through people. And this gave ordinary people a sense of purpose. And I've talked about that sense of purpose, that something like, you discover that Calvinism is only so much of the pie, and so you go in a direction like theonomic postmillennialism. But actually, it's the doctrine of vocation that can give you a better sense of purpose, not necessarily a doctrine that tells you that you're going to bring Christ's kingdom progressively throughout history. Guys like David Van Drunen have actually really helpfully argued that the doctrine of vocation is wrapped up in the sola that we know as soli Deo Gloria, that it was actually our work, actually being God's work through us for His glory, and that everything we do is for His glory. So this kind of ties into the fact that providence, God's providence, is His way of masking Himself through our callings. Right? So it's kind of two sides of the same coin. You have providence, but you also have calling on the other side of that coin. This is actually a way to relieve the tension between sovereignty and free will. When you keep the conversation on who is the final determining factor in the actions that you take or the salvation that you have, do you have the control or does God have the control? The conclusion is that one of you have the control, and then it just ends up being that Calvinism is the answer in a power struggle or a tug of war. Is it you or God? Whereas providence actually communicates that God is the one providing for people and love for His creation and care for His creation through individuals. right? And so our callings and the work that we do is actually God's work through us. So then you bring up the other confessional distinctive that you find in the Westminster and the Second London of first and second causation, that you're the second cause, but God was the first cause. He was the one that caused you to do what you're doing, and you're doing it, and he's doing it through you for your neighbor. Tension resolved. This comes up in a really helpful book by a man named Gene Edward Veith Jr., and he is summarizing another man's work, Gustav Wingreen, and his summary of Martin Luther's thought. So in this condensed work called God at Work, he argues for everything that I've been saying here. I love this one. This one knocked my socks right on off. You could take this one to the bank. What he's kind of arguing for is that callings like parenting, for example, is God showing his fatherhood to our children through fathers. God feeding us when mothers make a warm meal. When you go out to eat at a restaurant, yes, the waitress or waiter brought the food to you, but it was actually God that gave the food to you through that person that served you. And so when a police officer arrests a criminal, God just protected that town or city or society in his justice, and he showed his justice through that police officer. Passages in the New Testament on superiors and inferiors, like children with parents, slaves and masters, and then he even ties it into governing authorities. And he makes the argument that these passages are not exclusively just about who should obey whom, but they're also showing how God takes care of neighbors through other neighbors. And so children should obey their parents, because if parents are doing their duty, their commands are good and are for the safety, protection, and care of the child. And so I don't need to strain to love my wife as a work that will please God, but I actually need to see that God is loving my wife through my love, and I need to actually see it from her perspective.
You know whose fault this really is? Your mother's.
The Lord is showing love, and he's showing care, and he's showing providence to her through my calling as a husband, and vice versa. I don't need to expect her to work to try to please God, to be perfect in her submission, but I actually need to see God giving her the calling as wife and giving me things like support and love and trust and things like that. And so this kind of shows how vocation and calling are two sides of the same coin, that God's providence is in which he masks himself with our callings, and our work is actually his work through us. Are you a Baptist who wants to stay Baptist and understand Baptist theology a little bit better, but Bob the Baptist's videos only help you so much, and you want a conference to go to? Well, boy, do I have great news for you. The first ever Confessional Baptist Conference at First Baptist Church in Clinton, Louisiana, is on Saturday, July 12th, 2025. Each year is going to explore a different aspect of Baptist theology, and this year, they're discussing baptism. I am so excited about this event because the guys putting this conference on are some of the top Baptist voices today, namely Tom Hicks and Fred Malone. I cannot think of two better men to help others understand the Baptist faith better. So I definitely plan on being there, Lord willing. So in the description below, I have posted a link to their website with information, sign up, and pricing. It's $15 for singles, $20 for couples, and $30 for families. $10 each for any more than 3, and it's free for children under 10 years old. So check out the link in the description below. Sign up for the conference. I hope to see you there. And stay Baptist, my friends. Let me ask you a question. Does sovereignty communicate all of this rich truth about care and love and God working and taking care of his creation through neighbors toward one another? It's exclusively focused on the question, who's in control? It's more complicated than that. I love that God's in control, but this scratches at the fact that authority, actually in our culture, is more focused on disentangling the word authority from abuser. So like if I say authority, people hear me saying abuser.
Now we are going to enjoy this meal. No one can stop us from enjoying this meal, so enjoy it!
No, actually authority in the Reformed tradition, this is true, is supposed to be one who is placed in a position over others for their care.
Well, honey, I think people would love to listen to you. That's beautiful. Would you sing a little for your dad? Right here in the middle of the store?
To protect them, to provide for them, to make sure that they have everything that they need and that they live in a stable society. And so it's not just about who is in control or are our governing authorities in control of us. Yeah, yes, they are, but why? Providence says he is in control for his glory and the good of people, the good of his creation. He is taking care of his creation. So yes, the yours emphasis on sovereignty was a short-term win as an assault on this God is dead culture and not everything is meaningless. But it's lacking this confessional depth that the word providence carries. And again, I'll just say, please go consider John Flavel's teachings on this point, and I'll tell a brief little personal story. Recently, 4 difficult, not horrible, tragic things happened in successive order. And so one bad thing happened, and then the day that that bad thing was over, the next day, another bad thing happened. And that happened over and over and over, just me and my wife and my kids, just like little bitty things like people getting sick and things like that, things that were just difficult. And it's easy when a bad thing happens and then you turn around and that bad thing is over and then another hard thing happens to say, why do these bad things keep happening in successive order? I believe that if you really consider what John Flavel has to say, it'll influence your thinking like it has mine, and it'll teach you to say, wait, that's the wrong way of looking at it. It's not that one bad thing happened immediately after another bad thing happened. It's actually that God prevented one bad thing from taking place on the same day that another bad thing happened.
That was a close one.
Like, praise God, he is taking care of his people. And it's a good idea, Flavel argues, for us to sit back and consider all of the ways that God is in complete control of everything that happens to us because he loves us for his glory, because he's taking care of us.
And so it was. A wristwatch, say Harold Crick.
So meditate on the doctrine of providence. Incorporate that into your language and watch how it changes the way that you think, the way that you speak, the way that you live the Christian life. And stay Baptist, my friends. God is sovereign, 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 God. How many times are you gonna make me say it till you say something? As soon as I was like, she's gonna make me say this 150 times.